Rigden. I will say even more. As I have already mentioned, the Latin cross as a symbol of Christianity was introduced in the 4th century AD when the teaching of Jesus had been transformed into a religion, and the religion gained national status. Incidentally, in genealogy, the Latin cross usually marks the end of a person, the date of death. So in Christianity, besides this 4-pointed long cross intended for believers to wear, there also exist 6-pointed and 8-pointed so-called patriarchal crosses with 2 or 3 additional bars, which as a rule cross out the front essence. They're worn by archbishops and cardinals. The general concept of this religion interprets the presence of this upper bar as a board, plate for the aforementioned title of Jesus in the Latin abbreviation INRI, and if the sign also had a lower slanting bar, it was simply explained to a believer in the material context of the religious interpretation that this was supposedly a bar for Jesus' feet. Now let us consider concealment of the interpretation of symbolism of the cross from the masses, which had existed long before the emergence of the Christian religion. For example, in ancient Egypt, such designations of the crosses, which are currently known as the Tau cross and the Ankh cross, were popular. In the secret knowledge, the Tau cross meant, using the modern language, the human life in the material world, a manifestation of the emotions and thoughts initiated by the back and the lateral essences, whereas the Ankh cross already combined 2 different elements, the dominant circle and a Tau cross hanging from it. The Ankh cross symbolized the perfect human, with the spiritual nature dominating in him, the prevalence of the front essence over the other 3 essences, and domination of the spiritual over the material. This is why the Ankh cross was placed in the hands of the supreme ancient Egyptian gods as a spiritual symbol, a sign of immortality, of eternal life. The Ankh cross is also known as the key of life, the key to energy, the key to revival, of spiritual transformation. Such meanings were related to the symbolism of a certain stage of spiritual practices when a person's self-unfolding took place, a qualitative transformation of a person into an entirely different spiritual being. Moreover, knowledge about this cross and its symbolism existed not only in ancient Egypt, Africa, but also in ancient Europe, Asia, and America. So when an equilateral cross was placed on the Tau cross, that meant the power of man over the essences in the 3-dimensional world, while human qualities, the animal nature, dominated in him. In ancient times, such a symbol was usually used in magic, divination, fortune-telling, healing, and so on. If an equilateral cross was enclosed in a circle and placed above the Tau cross, it meant the death of a person dominated by the material, animal nature during his life. Simply put, this symbol meant leaving for reincarnation. However, other meanings of it existed as well. Anastasia. So it means that the patriarchal cross is in fact an equilateral cross above the Tau cross, a symbol of power over the material world through magic. This is also crossing out of the front essence, so that means it is rejection of the spiritual in favor of the material. Rigden. Quite right. While a bar in the lower part of the cross means refusal of your human past and devoting yourself to service. Only the question remains unanswered. Service to whom? The answer to it is found in the meaning of the dominant sign in this symbol. As for the long cross with an indication of 3 bars as stairs leading upwards, which today is called the papal cross, Since ancient times, such a sign has been used to indicate the one who sought power over the three-dimensional world when the symbolism of an individual person was involved. However, such delicate details are naturally never disclosed to believers. This happens partly because the hierarchical top group of people conceals them, and partly because ordinary religious ministers who adhere to the traditional interpretation of this religion are unaware of this information, and the latter was invented during formation of the main concept of a given religion to somehow explain this ancient symbol to the masses. Perhaps I shall give a simple example for a better understanding. If we ask a believer who wears a cross next to the skin what he feels when he remembers about it, sees its reflection in the mirror on his body, or touches it, we may then hear the answer, which is quite standard in such cases. The person will say that at this moment he recalls the suffering of Jesus Christ during the crucifixion, and that he feels a sense of guilt and his own sinfulness. Such an answer is typical of almost all the believers of this religion. Note that at this moment they do not recall the teaching of Christ, his sermons and guidance, do not think about the salvation of their soul, about love for God, but instead they feel a sense of guilt and suffering and experience fear. Why? Because the back and the right essences become active in their energy structures. This is a telling example of how signs and symbols work, influence at the subconscious level, and how priests use them in their systems to control the masses. It is no wonder they conceal the primordial knowledge from people. Otherwise, if people knew about it, they would start asking questions that are awkward for the religious leaders. For example, why they, the believers, are wearing a symbol that imputes a sense of guilt in them, leads them into depression at the subconscious level, stimulates suffering and negative memories about their past, while religious ministers are wearing a symbol of power over the material world. After all, by definition, both of them in their faith should be striving for love of God, the salvation of the soul, and for the spiritual world. Anastasia. Yes, when you begin to comprehend what kind of signs and symbols they surround you with from all sides, understanding comes why the material mind dominates the society even in places where people try to find a spiritual outlet for themselves. Rigdon. I have already said this many times, and I shall also repeat now. It is in the hands of people themselves to change the situation. Everything depends on the dominant choice of each person. But let us get back to the topic of the signs of the four essences. While the equilateral cross was a symbol of a regular person, the diagonal cross, a turned cross, and its variations, often with a circle in the center, refer to a personality which is moving along the path of knowledge and which is aware of sacred information about the human being and meditative practices related to the four essences. I emphasize, to a person who has knowledge, how he uses it, with which dominant in his consciousness is his personal choice. But most often in the sacred texts, the symbol of the diagonal cross or its variations pointed at the knowledge about the energy structure of a human, his essences, and interconnection with dimensions. Dimensions were conditionally represented as a number of steps of a truncated pyramid or a staircase, parts of patterns, lotus buds or its petals, contours of mountains or zigzag lines, circles within a circle, little lines, grains, and points. As a rule, they were equal to 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 in number. A number of 3 identical elements of a symbol usually indicated 3-dimensional space. 4, 3 dimensions plus the 4th one, time, and it could also serve as a symbol of the 4 essences. 5 represented 5-dimensional space, but generally this number was associated with a 5-pointed star as one of the symbols of the feminine principle, a sign of the manifested forces of Allat in the 5th dimension. 6 stood for the 6th dimension, which is the highest possible one for the person with the material dominant, from which he can influence the material world in an altered state of consciousness. And presence of 7 identical elements in a pattern meant the 7th dimension, indicating a perfect person and the structure of the world up to the 7th dimension, or the concept of heaven, nirvana, and liberation of the soul. Sometimes 8, 9, 12, 13, and 33 or 72 conditional marks were depicted near the symbolic indication of the 7th dimension, pointing at the knowledge about the universe. Such sacred information was often recorded in patterns of ritual objects, garments, or sacred buildings. Variations of the diagonal cross were quite diverse. A diagonal cross in the form of 4 connected triangles with a circle in the center, circle centers of triangular spaces, clover crosses, narrow in the center and expanding out to the edges, snakes entwined in the form of a cross, and so on. If it was necessary to point at or emphasize the activation, dominance, or blocking of one of the essences, or specific work with these essences, then this was marked with an additional sign in the corresponding area of the diagonal cross. Anastasia. Perhaps it is worth emphasizing that we're talking about the sacred or magical symbols denoting the sacral knowledge of one or another nation. In general, one can say that the main symbols of the 4 essences are triangles and hemispheres, which touch each other, but practically do not intersect. Rigdon. Absolutely. At that, not simply triangles or just hemispheres. As a rule, these are equilateral triangles, the 3 sides of which point at 3-dimensionality of the space from which the observer, personality, begins his journey of spiritual development. 2 triangles lying horizontally with peaks touching each other symbolize the right and the left essences. This is a kind of an infinity sign, a constant return to the same tenets from the world of matter, the so-called variable stability. This is a stable domination of either the right or the left essence, a flow of equal force from one area of catching or rather hunting for the attention of man to another, if of course these 2 horizontal triangles are considered in the context of the life of a person who does not control his thoughts. But this is typical precisely of the usual work of the lateral essences when the personality chooses thoughts and emotions from the animal nature. But if a person reaches heights in his spiritual development, then the lateral essences change their usual working mode. They become helpers, that force which by its connection with other dimensions helps to know the invisible diversity, conditional infinity of this world. And the triangles pointing downwards and upwards are a special case which needs to be considered in more detail. 2 vertically placed triangles that touch each other's vertices symbolize the front and the back essences. In the context of the original knowledge about the 4 essences of a human, the triangle pointing upward was a symbol of the back essence, the past, and the visible manifested material world. It is not coincidental that people would later associate a triangle of such a shape specifically with male principle. Its meaning is far from greatness or likeness to a mountain towering towards heaven or to the 3 principles of construction of the universe, the symbol of God. The mountain is a separate image and symbol which is mainly associated with the concept of another dimension, and the symbol of God in the form of a triangle pointing upward signified the three principles of construction of the universe: God, the idea; Lotus, the plan; and Allat, implementation of the idea and the plan. An equilateral triangle pointing upwards, according to the primordial knowledge about the human being, signifies two things. Firstly, starting state of human, as an observer in the three-dimensional world prior to his independent spiritual development, as an object created in the image and likeness of God. The soul is initially enclosed in a person, and three conditions of his spiritual development are set: the spiritual idea, the plan, and an implementation of the idea. Secondly, if we're actually speaking already about the process of human spiritual development itself, the emphasis of which shifts to the front essence, that is, to the upper triangle pointing downward, or on the contrary, if we are speaking about the person that is bogged down in matter and in whom the animal nature dominates, then the meaning of the lower triangle was quite different. In this case, the triangle pointing upwards symbolizes not only the back essence, but also aggression of the material world. That is why it was associated with the element of fire in some cases: movement of matter from expansion to contraction, from the outside to the inside, concentration on the will of the animal mind and its power over the pyramidal hierarchy of matter. In other words, the triangle pointing upwards means that which is based on the earthly, material, and temporal, and which strives for power. In the primordial knowledge, an equilateral triangle pointing downwards doesn't only denote the front essence, with the help of which the person grows and develops spiritually. Since ancient times, the symbol has meant the creating force of Allat, that is, movement of the spiritual from the primary point of implementation, from manifestation of the Creator's plan to constant creation and expansion, to perfect form contained in this plan. It is no coincidence that in ancient times a triangle pointing downwards was associated with symbols of the feminine principle, with supreme goddesses who, in the beliefs of different peoples, embodied the creating functions of the Great Mother as the progenitress of the whole world, and connection with the water environment, which was in association with the spiritual world. According to the sacred primordial knowledge about a human, when the personality chooses the spiritual nature, a manifestation of the creating power of Allat happens in it in the form of spiritual awakening, an expanded state of consciousness, and manifestation of the spiritual love. That is why during spiritual practices, a person experiences feelings of comprehension of everything, omniscience, and all-encompassing love for the whole world. This is precisely the work of his front essence, and a manifestation of the powers of Allat, which restore and manifest the connection of the personality with the soul. Echoes of this knowledge are traced in the sacred treatises about the world and man, in mythological stories, images, and rituals of many peoples of the world. Anastasia. Incidentally, in the Trypillian civilization, for example, it was the symbols of two vertically placed triangles touching each other's vertices that were often depicted on ritual dishes, even with designation of the direction of energy movement during spiritual practices. Rigdon. Yes, these symbols are present everywhere. It is just that most people do not notice them. They're not interested in them, and they do not understand them due to the absence of the primordial knowledge. For example, in ancient India, a triangle pointing downwards was used as a symbol of goddess Shakti, whom I have already mentioned, an associative image of manifestation of the powers of Allat, and for god Shiva, one of the three deities in the Indian mythology, that embodied also the destructive forces. It was a triangle pointing upwards. Here's another example. When the Greeks visited the banks of the triangle estuary of the great river of ancient Egypt, the Nile, they started calling it Delta. For ancient Egyptians, this estuary, which gave access to the sea, just like the life-sustaining river itself, was comparable to the sacred lotus, to a triangle pointing downwards which embodied the feminine principle. And the delta base, having multiple channels that lead out to the sea, the aquatic environment, was associated with spiritual paths which in the sacred interpretations of the ancient Egyptians were associated with a different world, the spiritual one. Many of the ancient Egyptian goddesses endowed with functions of Allat were mistresses of the aquatic environment or were connected to it and to a lotus. That is why, among the Greeks too, the delta became a symbol of the feminine principle, the door of life, despite the fact that the word itself is derived from the fourth letter of the Greek alphabet, the form of which is a triangle pointing upwards. All in all, it is worthwhile to look more closely at least at the known history of different cultures, and one can find a lot of interesting information. I'm not even mentioning the long-forgotten cultures which modern people do not remember, but the archaeological discoveries of which will shake the world in the future with their unique artifacts and spiritual knowledge, provided, of course, that humanity will have this future. And a few more words about a variation of the symbolism of overlaying of a triangle pointing downwards and a triangle pointing upwards over each other, which has been widespread among mystical, occult, and religious movements since ancient times. According to the primordial knowledge, if in this symbol, the top triangle pointing downwards is depicted in white color, the divine feminine principle, the forces of the spiritual world, and beneath it, you can see its edges, there is a triangle pointing upwards in black color, the masculine principle, forces of matter, then this means supremacy of the spiritual world and of the creating forces of Allat over the material world in six-dimensional space. And if the triangle pointing upwards overlaps the triangle pointing downwards, it means dominance of the animal mind, the material world over the spiritual one, a magical influence on matter from the sixth dimension with the dominance of the animal nature, man's use of the powers of Allat not for spiritual liberation, but for gaining power in the material world. Such a sign, so to speak, with exactly the opposite meaning, as a rule was placed by people seeking secret power over the three-dimensional world and serving the will and aims of the animal mind. If the sign was depicted without indicating the dominating triangle, it was also called the reversed sign, because the triangles of the front and the back essences were interchanged in it, and the lateral essences were dominant, with indication of them as triangles located in the vertical. It also meant crossing out of the rhombus, one of the symbols of the spiritual transformation of man. In ancient times, this symbol was used mainly in black magic. Anastasia. This symbol, by the way, is now widely popularized all over the world under the name of the Star of David, naturally with a plausible interpretation for the broad masses of the perfect union of spirit and matter with the dominant triangle pointing upwards. And then people wonder why they live in such an unhappy world, where there is a lot of anger and aggression. Rigdon. Well, who is to blame for people not being interested in more than what is being imposed on them by the material mind? In ancient times in the East, this sign was known as the ruler of jinns, a magical symbol of the person ruling over matter with help of powers intended for spiritual development. if one or more triangles pointing downwards were placed inside a large triangle pointing upwards, this meant man's use of his unique spiritual powers for other purposes, that is, for obtaining certain power in the material world. For example, if 3 triangles pointing downwards were placed inside a triangle pointing upwards, then this meant the use of the powers of Allat by the material mind for its own purposes, as a rule for achieving temporary power in the 3-dimensional world. Incidentally, 3 triangles pointing downwards symbolize the divine principles, the idea, the plan, and its implementation, the realization of this plan. In ancient images, one can see 3 triangles pointing downwards that are not restricted by anything. On top of them, a 4th large triangle pointing downwards is placed, which means man's movement towards spiritual liberation. In short, the right use by a person of his life force. Anastasia. Please tell the readers more about hemispheres. They're also quite common in patterns of sacred ritual objects and on ancient artifacts as a conditional designation of the 4 essences. Rigdon. Yes, for designation of the 4 essences, they also use the symbols of semicircle, crescent, and arc as a certain part of the whole. This being said, the lateral arcs, which were located vertically, were symbols of the lateral essences. The arc that resembled an overturned crescent or a bowl placed upside down symbolized the back essence, and that is why in the sacred symbolism of peoples it was associated with the past that was deprived of life, and it also meant a dead teaching oriented towards the material. However, the sign of an arc or a crescent with horns pointing upwards was originally used to designate the front essence as a symbol of manifestation of the powers of the spiritual world, Allat. This, strictly speaking, gave rise to the appearance of designations of other essences precisely in the form of distinctive arcs and hemispheres. Thanks to such a depiction of the front essence and of the sign of Allat, some peoples acquired associative symbol of a bowl as a spiritual container which is ready to be filled with creating powers of Allat, or in the beliefs of the ancients with crystal clear water, which was an association with the spiritual world.